Hello, Modern World History students. We're continuing with unit number 6, and now moving on to section number 2. So, in the previous section, you saw how the Bosnian Serb nationalist terrorist organization, the Black Hand, pulled off a flawed but ultimately successful assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand Habsburg and his wife Sophie. You also see how Austria-Hungary's response to that was to issue an ultimatum, a demand followed by a threat to the government of the country of Serbia. And then you saw how Serbia went for assistance to Russia and received assistance from Russia, or assurances of assistance from Russia, based on the impulse of pan-Slavism, the idea that Slavic nations ought to stand up for each other and fight for each other. So now the ball was in Austria-Hungary's court. Did they wish to make war against Serbia and Russia? Now that it wasn't just going to be Austria-Hungary versus little Serbia anymore, but Serbia and big Russia, what was Austria-Hungary going to do? Well, for one thing, they wanted to make sure that they had sort of their big supporter on their side, and that was Germany. And so the focus of this section is on Germany's role in the outbreak and expansion of the First World War. One thing to explain how actions by the German government contributed to the outbreak and expansion of the war. You'll hear about the role played in all this by Kaiser Wilhelm II. You'll learn about his so-called blank check to Austria-Hungary, and you'll learn about the Schlieffen Plan and how it involved the violation of Belgium and its neutrality. So we're going to start at the top of page 7. And the first thing to talk about here is Kaiser Wilhelm II, because he was the one to whom Austria-Hungary's emperor, Franz Joseph, was turning for support in light of the fact that he had this sort of looming potential war with Serbia and Russia. Austria-Hungary was certainly capable of taking on Serbia all by itself, but Serbia and Russia, that was another story. But luckily for Austria-Hungary, they had supporters. Because if you remember, Austria-Hungary were part of an alliance called the Triple Alliance. That alliance dated back to a time when Otto von Bismarck was still the Chancellor of Germany. That is, before he'd been fired by Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Triple Alliance included Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy. So it would seem like Austria-Hungary had assurances of support from Germany and Italy. The problem was that the Triple Alliance was a defensive alliance. It committed the three countries to support each other in the event that one of them was attacked. The problem here was that if war was declared, it would be Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, and presumably then Russia as well. The question that Franz Joseph had for Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was, you are bound to defend us in the event that we're attacked, but if we go to war with Serbia and then Russia joins Serbia, will Germany support us? Now let's talk again about Kaiser Wilhelm II before we try to understand his response to Franz Josef's request. As I mentioned before, Kaiser Wilhelm II was a relatively young person when he had become emperor. And he was always sort of disappointed with the way that Otto von Bismarck had sort of managed Germany's business. Bismarck was a peacemaker. He didn't want to provoke other countries. And so he had not built up Germany's navy into a navy strong enough to challenge Britain, for example. He had not fought with other European countries to try and gobble up as much of Africa as possible. And that was part of Kaiser Wilhelm II's exasperation with Bismarck. He felt like he had not done the things to force the rest of Europe and the rest of the world to take Germany seriously. He felt like the more established countries, remember Germany had only been in existence in 1871, so basically 43 years by this time. He felt like the other more established countries of Europe did not take Germany seriously, didn't give Germany the respect that it deserved. Germany was one of the largest countries in Europe in terms of population and land area. It had a dynamic, fast-growing economy, a strong military, And yet, Wilhelm felt that that Germany, and by extension, he was not getting the respect that they deserved from France, from Britain, from Russia, from these other countries. Germany, he felt, must have its place in the sun. And he believed in the end that the only way for Germany to get its place in the sun and to gain the respect of the other countries of Europe was to have this big, strong navy and build up an empire, and even go to war to prove Germany's strength. So he had built up Germany's navy to challenge the British, and that's what had sort of pushed the British to join an alliance with France and Russia. He had challenged to try and build up a German empire. And now he was confronted with this question of Franz Josef. We have an alliance. It is a defensive alliance. But if we, Austria-Hungary, declare war on Serbia and then in turn are attacked by Russia, will Germany back us up? Well, I think you probably already have figured out the answer to that question. How would it make Germany look if they did not back up Austria-Hungary, an ally, and also a country governed by a German royal family, the Habsburgs? How would it make Germany look if they didn't back up Austria-Hungary in this case? Even if technically it didn't fit quite the way that their alliance was supposed to work, would it make Germany look weak or strong? It would make Germany look weak, wouldn't it? I mean, if you don't stand by an ally, you don't worry about technically whether this is a strictly defensive alliance or the Austria-Hungary, you don't worry about that. If Germany stood by while Austria-Hungary was sort of forced to submit to Serbia and Russia, Germany would look weak, not strong. And that is the exact opposite of what Kaiser Wilhelm wanted for Germany. And so when Franz Josef asked the Kaiser if Germany would support Austria-Hungary in the event of war between Austria-Hungary on one side, Serbia and Russia on the other, Wilhelm said yes. This is sometimes referred to as a blank check. A blank check, I mean, a lot of people don't use checks anymore to pay for things. They use credit cards and electronic fund transfers and things like that. But a blank check is a check where you sign your name to it and you say pay to the order of so and so, and you don't put in the value. You don't put in how much money. You leave that to the person who you're giving the check to fill in, so they can fill in as much as they want. Giving somebody a blank check is basically trusting them to take whatever they need from you. And so some people say that Wilhelm, by saying yes to Franz Josef, gave Austria-Hungary a blank check. Basically said, okay, we're on board, take what you need. And in doing so, basically gave Austria-Hungary all of the confidence that they needed, that Germany would be on their side, to then declare war on Serbia, knowing that that would mean that Russia would come in too. So notice this is another moment where the war perhaps could have been avoided. If Kaiser Wilhelm had simply said no to Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary would have been faced with the prospect of fighting Serbia and Russia alone, then perhaps Austria-Hungary would have backed off on their ultimatum and said to the Serbs, okay, we'll accept your support suppressing the Black Hand and your promise to keep your people from being anti-Austrian. We don't need that chunk of land that we demanded from you. Austria-Hungary could have backed off, accepted the portions of the ultimatum that Serbia had agreed to, and the war perhaps would not have happened. Remember, the same thing was true of Russia. When Serbia went to Russia and said, will you help us out? If Russia had said no, Serbia probably would have had to back down and give up some of their land because they couldn't take on Austria-Hungary all by themselves. But Tsar Nicholas of Russia had said yes to Serbia. That gave Serbia the courage, the confidence to say no to Austria-Hungary's demand for land. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm said yes to Austria-Hungary. That gave Austria-Hungary the courage, the confidence to go ahead and declare war on Serbia. So there were really two opportunities here where an answer of no, either from Tsar Nicholas II of Russia to the Serbs or Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany to Austria, could have prevented the war. Instead, these two bigger, more powerful countries allowed themselves to be drawn into this war by smaller, less powerful countries. Russia allowed themselves to be drawn into war by Serbia. Germany allowed themselves to be drawn into war by Austria-Hungary. And on July 28th, 1 month after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia then declared war on Austria-Hungary, and Germany then declared war on Serbia and Russia. And now you've got a war. World War I was on. But it really wasn't a world war, was it? It was really just a war. It was more of a regional war. It wasn't even a continental war. It didn't encompass the entire continent of Europe. It was really just a regional war fought here in Eastern Europe between 4 countries. That's not a world war. It's not even a continent-wide war. It was a regional war, and it could have stayed that way had it not been for a decision made by the Germans. Oh, sorry, declarations of war. Austria-Hungary versus Serbia, Russia versus Austria-Hungary, Germany versus Russia, and Serbia. So what was the decision that the Germans made that led to the war becoming a continent-wide war? Well, it went back some years. As soon as France and Russia, and then, of course, the United Kingdom as well, had formed their alliance, the Triple Entente, right? Wilhelm II, immediately upon the formation of that alliance, realized that he had sort of blundered, that he had positioned Germany to be at a very disadvantageous situation if war ever did break out. That is, a situation of having to fight France in the west and Russia in the east, 2 powerful countries. Basically, a situation where Germany would be forced to fight the kind of war that Otto von Bismarck had always tried to avoid Germany having to fight, right? Bismarck would have never allowed this to happen. But Bismarck was gone, Wilhelm had fired him, and by now he had died. Bismarck was gone, and Wilhelm had sort of blundered his way into a situation where France and Russia were now allies. Alarmed by Germany's growing strength, they had become allies. And now, if Germany was to fight a war, they would end up fighting that 2-front war. They would end up fighting a war where they, Germany, would have to divide their forces between fighting the French in the west, Russia in the east. And so Kaiser Wilhelm II went to the chief of the German General Staff. That's a fancy way of saying the highest ranked general in the German army. His name was Alfred von Schlieffen. Alfred von Schlieffen. And remember, this is now 5 years before the outbreak of World War I. I'm dialing you back 5 years. And basically, Wilhelm said to Alfred von Schlieffen, I need you to come up with a plan that will allow Germany to fight a 2-front war and win. And so, after Alfred von Schlieffen got done cursing out the Kaiser for this, he got to work. And he devised a plan, which became known as the Schlieffen Plan, that was very bold and sort of creative. And it actually did offer the prospect that Germany could find a way to fight this 2-front war against France and Russia and win. But it was very reliant on timing. Here's what I mean. Schlieffen said, Russia has the ability to assemble a huge army. Russia is a huge country. They have the ability to assemble a huge army. But it will take them a long time to do it. Russia could assemble a huge army because its population was so big and there were so many peasants that the Russians could draft into the army. The problem was that they were scattered out across Russia, which was this big country. And Russia was really behind on the development of transportation infrastructure, particularly railroads. And so what von Schlieffen said is, it will take the Russians at least 60 days to fully mobilize their army. So to mobilize an army means to assemble the army and get them in a position where they're ready to fight and actually deploy them to the front where the fighting will take place. That's what it means to mobilize an army. And Schlieffen said it will take the Russians 60 days, at least, to fully mobilize their army. So here's what we can do. We can take 1/8 of Germany's army. We're talking about 1/8 of Germany's army. We're talking about maybe 100,000 men. We can take 1/8 of Germany's army and we can deploy them to the east basically to hold off any Russians who might show up, right? But we don't really have to worry about fighting the Russians for the first 2 months of the war because it will take them that long to mobilize their army. Now, what that does is that buys us time to basically dump the bulk of the German army, 7/8 of it, um, almost a million men, into the attack on France. If we do this, if we put by far the majority of the German army into the invasion of France, 7/8 of the German army into the invasion of France, we will have overwhelming numbers against the French army. The French army will be outnumbered by 10 to 20%. And with that numerical advantage, we will simply overwhelm the French, and we can defeat them in about 6 weeks of fighting. Now, where did von Schlieffen get the idea that Germany could defeat the French in just 6 weeks? Well, think about that for a second. See if you come up with the answer. Why did von Schlieffen believe that with overwhelming force the Germans could defeat the French in just 6 weeks of fighting? Because they had done it before. Remember in the Franco-Prussian War, when the Prussians attacked France, they had basically destroyed France's armies in just 6 weeks of fighting. Now, the French hunkered down in Paris, and the Prussians had to besiege the city, which meant they had to surround the city and sort of patiently wait for it to run out of food before it surrendered. And that took several months. But in terms of destroying France's ability to attack Prussia at that time, they had wiped out the French army in just 6 weeks of fighting. So Schlieffen's idea that the French could be defeated in 6 weeks was not something out of a fantasy. It was something that had already happened, that a German army had already done only about 34 years prior to this. So, with overwhelming force, by putting just a small fraction of the German army in the east to hold off whatever Russians show up, and putting the bulk of the German army into the attack on France, we can use overwhelming force to destroy the French army, to defeat them in 6 weeks. Then, having done that, we can shift our army gradually over to the Eastern Front, using Germany's excellent railroads. So unlike Russia, which had very poor railroads, Germany had excellent railroads. And so after fighting the French and defeating them in 6 weeks, they could shift their army across Germany to the east, and they would arrive just in time to fight the Russians, who would be completing their mobilization a few weeks after that. So the Schlieffen plan was really rather creative. High risk, to be sure, but a rather creative solution to a very difficult problem. And it held out the prospect that Germany could actually fight a two-front war against France and Russia and win. But you notice that timing is essential. Timing is essential to the entire plan. And that's where things got a little complicated. Because you'll notice that big arrow that shows the German army invading France, it doesn't pass from Germany directly into France, right? The invasion was not planned in this area here, where Germany actually shared a border with France. You'll notice that instead, the invasion passes through Belgium. Well, let's talk about why. The reason why Schlieffen did not plan to have German armies cross over their border with France is that this area is quite mountainous. It's a mountainous area. This is where Alsace-Lorraine is located. Again, remember, Alsace-Lorraine was that portion, that little part of the world between France and Germany, where the population is about half French, half German, ethnically. Prussia had taken it from France during the Franco-Prussian War, and it was now part of Germany. That whole area, though, was very mountainous, and France had constructed strong border defenses there as well, like concrete fortresses and things like that. And so the problem was, if Germany was to invade France and defeat France in just 6 weeks of fighting, the invasion could not happen here. It would take too long. Moving over those mountains and forcing their way past those French fortresses, it could be done, but it would slow the German advance down too much. Belgium, on the other hand, was broad and flat, a nice coastal plain, a highway for an army to move, a nice broad flat highway that an army could move through very quickly. That would also allow the Germans to bypass the French fortresses that the French had built, simply by forcing their way through Belgium. Now, the problem with that is that Belgium was a neutral country. That is to say, Belgium was not in the war, and they would never get into the war. Belgium had signed a treaty. You might remember this from our unit on nationalism. Belgium, after their independence, had signed a treaty with the United Kingdom, with the British, in which the British promised to protect Belgium. In the event that any country ever invaded Belgium, they would have the protection of the British. The British had done this because Belgium is located immediately across the English Channel from Britain. And if any country that was hostile to Britain ever took over Belgium, they could use it as an invasion point for invading Britain. So the British, way back in 1839, had signed a treaty with the Belgians, had formed a sort of an alliance with them, in which the United Kingdom, the British, had said that if any country invades Belgium, we will fight them. In return, what the British wanted was for Belgium to agree to be neutral in all wars, that Belgium would agree not to join any side in any war, and the Belgians took that commitment seriously. So here's the problem. If Germany wants to invade France by way of Belgium, that will involve a violation of Belgium's borders and of its neutrality. And it will bring the United Kingdom, it will bring the British into the war, because the British had an almost 100-year-old treaty with the Belgians promising to do so if Belgium was ever invaded. So Schlieffen, in creating the Schlieffen Plan, was presented with this problem. Well, yes, we want to have our army pass through Belgium because that will allow the army to get into France quickly, win the war quickly within the first 6 weeks, which is what you need in order to shift the army out to the east to fight the Russians. The problem is, by invading Belgium, won't you bring the British into the war? And Schlieffen's answer to that was yes. We must invade Belgium in order to win the war quickly, but that will bring the British into the war. Schlieffen acknowledged that. But, he said, here's the thing. The British, as an island, rely on their navy to protect them. They don't really have a strong army that they sort of keep in place during times of peace. Once the war breaks out, it will take the British time to recruit and train an army. And by the time they've recruited and trained an army and deployed it to France, the war will already be over. It will take the British more than 6 weeks to recruit and train and deploy an army to France. By that time, we will have defeated the French, and the war on the Western Front, the war between Germany and France, will have already been won. It'll be too late for the British to make a difference. So notice that Schlieffen's plan, creative, bold, risky, it relies on timing in two different things. It relies on the Russians taking at least 60 days to mobilize their army after the outbreak of the war, allowing Germany to defeat the French before shifting their army east to fight the Russians. It also relies on the idea that Germany can defeat France in 6 weeks, so that even if the British join the war, because Germany's going to invade Belgium, it won't matter. It'll be too late. It'll take the British too long to mobilize an army to fight. So timing is a huge part of the Schlieffen Plan. But the reason why Germany is going to invade Belgium is in order to defeat France quickly enough, that they can then shift their forces to the east using their great railroads to fight the Russians. So this is the plan that the German army entered into the war with. A plan which starts with an invasion of Belgium and France. The problem is this. That may have been the war that Schlieffen planned to fight, because that's what Wilhelm told him to do, but that's not the war that the Germans got. They didn't get a two-front war against France and Russia. They got just a one-front war, really, against Serbia and Russia. So they're not fighting France and Russia, west and east. They're fighting Serbia and Russia. And they can largely rely on the Austro-Hungarians, their allies, to take care of the Serbs, so they thought. So basically, they're only fighting Russia. So the thing is that the war that Schlieffen planned to fight is not the Germans now. That's not the war that the Germans are now looking at. Now, for what it's worth, Schlieffen by now had died. By the outbreak of World War I in July of 1914, Alfred von Schlieffen had died. The question is, do you go ahead and implement his plan, or do you not go ahead and implement his plan? Well, the Kaiser's response was, no. That may have been what we planned for, but we're not at war with France. So let's just direct all of our forces toward the east to fight the Russians. That was Kaiser Wilhelm's answer. He said, hey, we're lucky. The war that we're fighting isn't a two-front war. Let's direct the full forces of our army to the east to fight the Russians. But the German army officers, the German army commanders who had taken over after Schlieffen died, said, you can't do that. And Wilhelm said, well, why not? Why can't we do that? And the answer of the German army officers was, there's the United Kingdom joining the war. Sorry. The answer of the German army officers was, if you do that, if you direct all of your forces eastward against the Russians, France will certainly take advantage of our preoccupation with fighting the Russians, and they'll attack us. After all, France has an alliance with Russia, the Triple Entente, so that if we declare war against Russia, France will join them. We'll end up fighting them. But if we have directed all of our efforts to the east and all of our resources to the east to fight Russia, we'll have nothing to protect ourselves against being attacked from the west by France. So even if we are not, and they said, even if France didn't have an alliance with Russia, if we focused all of our efforts on Russia, France would certainly take advantage of that to attack us, to retake Alsace-Lorraine. Remember that area, Alsace-Lorraine, that Prussia had taken from France in the Franco-Prussian War, half French, half German. France obviously wanted it back. France wanted revenge against Germany for their humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. And so the German generals were telling the Kaiser, if you direct all of our army to the east to fight the Russians, whether France had an alliance with Russia or not, they would then take advantage of that to attack us, to try to get back Alsace-Lorraine. So even though we're not at war with France, we need to assume that we will be at war with France. We need to treat this war as if this is the war that Schlieffen was planning for, and we need to go ahead and implement his plan. And Kaiser Wilhelm accepted that argument. So as a result of that, even though they were in fact only at war with Russia and Serbia, on August 1st, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium, with the invasion of France sort of on the menu once they had passed through Belgium. Germany declared war on Belgium and France. They had already declared war on Russia and Serbia 3 days earlier. Now they declared war on Belgium and France as well. Of course, when Germany declared war on Belgium and France and began their invasion of Belgium, the United Kingdom, that is the British, declared war on Germany because their alliance, their treaty with Belgium required that. And now you do have a continent-wide war. It had started out as simply a regional war fought in Eastern Europe between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one hand, and Russia and Serbia on the other hand. And that's all it had to be. But it was the decision of Germany to then expand the war into Western Europe by declaring war on France also and invading France by way of Belgium, which then brought in Belgium and France, but also the United Kingdom or Britain into the war. So, although Germany did not start the war, that certainly was more along the lines of, Austria-Hungary. Germany certainly made the decisions that resulted in the war expanding into Western Europe and becoming a continent-wide war. That was a result, for sure, of decisions made by the German government. All right, so this is a good time to sort of take stock of where we are now that the war is underway and remind ourselves who's fighting on what side, and also to sort of understand where they're fighting. So, section three, which is participants and fronts, is a section in which I hope you'll learn why fighting was taking place across Europe and why each of the warring countries was engaged on the fronts where they were. So, we're going to remind you, or actually not remind you, but introduce you to the Allied powers and the Central powers, which were the two sides that were fighting in the war. And then we'll show you what the action was on the Eastern Front, Middle Eastern Front, Southern Front, and Western Front. This is really, more than anything, a sort of a setting the stage type part of the lesson, and sort of a slightly vocabulary building part of the lesson as well. Vocabulary that is essential to understanding the rest of the war. So you'll see that on this page, we have spaces to write notes. This is page 8. We have spaces to write notes, and we have a map. And I encourage you to use both as we do this little section here, section 3. So, the Allied powers. Let's talk about who the Allied powers were. Well, the base of the Allied powers, the core of the Allied powers, were the countries that made up the Triple Entente. So remember, the Triple Entente was France, the United Kingdom, and Russia, right? France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. They made up the Triple Entente. And as the war began, they were joined by additional countries that were not members of the Triple Entente. So now that the war is underway, we don't simply refer to the Triple Entente anymore. We now refer to the Allied powers. The Allied powers. So that starts with France, the United Kingdom or Britain, and Russia. Of course, Serbia is also part of the Allied powers because, remember, they were the ones being attacked to start this war in the first place, and they're the ones whom the Russians are helping. Similarly, Belgium was a member of the Allied powers because they were being attacked, invaded by Germany, as Germany was trying to get through to France, and it's Belgium whom the United Kingdom joined the war in support of. So far, at the moment when the war broke out, the Allied powers consisted really of 5 countries: Belgium, France, Russia, Serbia, and the United Kingdom. So I would encourage you, if you have not already done so, to list them in your notes at the top of page 8, and I would also encourage you to label them on your map. Why don't you pause the video for a second and do that? Now, there will be additional countries who will join the Allied powers. So, for example, in the spring of 1915, Italy joined the Allied powers. And you might look at that and say, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure Italy was a member of the Triple Alliance, the alliance that included Germany and Austria-Hungary. And you're right, they were a member of the Triple Alliance along with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But remember that the Triple Alliance only required those 3 countries to protect each other in the event that one of them was attacked. When Austria-Hungary precipitated the war by attacking Serbia, Italy said, wait a minute, this is not our war, and we are not obligated to defend you. Italy felt no obligation to defend Austria-Hungary against Russia because Austria-Hungary, Italy felt, had provoked the war. First of all, with its outrageous demands and its ultimatum to Serbia, and then its decision to go forth with war against Serbia even after it was clear that Serbia was supported by Russia. So the Italians did not support Germany and Austria-Hungary, their allies from the Triple Alliance. Instead, when the war broke out, Italy declared itself to be neutral. When that happened, the allies in the West, the United Kingdom and France, said, wait a minute, there's an opportunity here. Italy has declared that they are not going to fight alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. Perhaps we can get them on our side. And as a result of secret negotiations, in which the British and the French promised Italy certain gains of territory after the war. So there were parts of this part of Europe right here where there were Italian people who were living, but they were living outside of Italy itself. They were living in what was at that time Austria-Hungary. And the British and the French said to the Italians, if you join the Allied powers, then we will promise you that after we win the war, we'll strip these areas away from Austria-Hungary and give them to Italy. So Italy, in the spring of 1915, actually joined the Allied powers in anticipation of and with the promise that when they won the war, they would get additional land from Austria-Hungary. So Italy became a member of the Allied powers. Japan is not on this map because this is a map of Europe, but Japan eventually joined the Allied powers as well. The reason why they joined is that, remember, Japan is in this process of trying to build up their own sort of empire in East Asia and the Pacific. They had fought China in 1894 and Russia in 1905. They had taken Korea and they had made it part of the Japanese Empire in 1910. And now the Japanese saw an opportunity to strip away Germany's colonies in the Pacific. Germany did not have very many colonies in the Pacific. They had some possessions in China, just like all the other European countries did. They possessed a couple islands out in the Pacific. But the Japanese realized that the Germans would be preoccupied with fighting the war in Europe, and Japan, with their fully modern navy, expected to strip away all of Germany's colonies and islands and then add them to the Japanese Empire. So Japan actually joined the side of the Allied powers as well. And of course, the United States eventually joined the Allied powers. The United States, when the war broke out in late July and early August of 1914, declared themselves neutral. And the United States remained neutral until April of 1917. So really, almost for 3 years, the United States remained neutral. But eventually, actions taken by the German Navy regarding submarine warfare and the attacking of American cargo ships that were supplying Britain and France during the war led the United States to join the war on the side of the Allied powers. We'll get into that in more detail as we tell the story of the war. So the Allied powers, Belgium, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, Serbia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Well, let's talk about who they were fighting against. That is the Central Powers. So the Central Powers, you already know, Germany and Austria-Hungary, who had tied themselves to each other from the very beginning of this process. It was Germany's promise of support to Austria-Hungary that had given Austria-Hungary the courage, the confidence to declare war on Serbia, knowing that that would lead them to war with Russia as well. They perhaps expected Italy to join them, since Italy was a member of their alliance, the Triple Alliance, but Italy did not. So as the war progressed, the Central Powers added the Ottoman Empire. So I mentioned the Ottoman Empire before. It is an empire centered on what is today Turkey. It's the Empire of the Turks. It had at one time controlled most of this territory here in southeastern Europe. By this time, it was shrunk down to just this part of southeastern Europe, as well as territory in the Middle East and North Africa. So the Ottoman Empire joined Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they became known as the Central Powers. So this war is a matchup between the Allied powers and the Central Powers. The Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. This is a war that was fought on many fronts. So if you're not familiar with the term front, we've talked about two-front wars, for example. A front is a geographical location where fighting is going on during a war. It's a geographical location where there's fighting going on. So on our map, you can locate 4 different fronts where fighting was going on. So take, for example, the Eastern Front. Nobody expected that the earliest fighting in the war would take place on the Eastern Front, because, as Alfred von Schlieffen had predicted, it would take Russia at least 60 days to mobilize their full army. And yet, there was action very early on the Eastern Front. So you can see that on the Eastern Front, the fighting is being done for the Allied powers by Russia. Russia alone was fighting on the side of the Allied powers on the Eastern Front. They were facing off against Germany and Austria-Hungary. So as the war progressed, Germany and Austria-Hungary would both invade Russia, the Germans invading sort of the northern part of Russia and Austria-Hungary invading the southern part of Russia. So the war on the Eastern Front features Austria fighting for the Allied powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary fighting for the Central Powers. On the other side of Europe, we have the Western Front. The Western Front is a narrower front, a tighter front than the Eastern Front. Most of the fighting here is concentrated on the boundary between Germany, Belgium, and France. The fighting is all going on really along those boundary lines, particularly the boundary between Belgium and France. Germany had invaded Belgium. Belgium was a tiny country with a tiny army, and so the Germans at the beginning of the war invaded and occupied Belgium. Belgium remained occupied by the German army really throughout the entire war. And so a lot of the fighting was going on sort of right here in the boundary between Belgium and France. So on the side of the Allied powers, well, let's do the Central Powers first. On the side of the Central Powers, it's really just Germany fighting on the Western Front. So Germany is fighting for the Central Powers on the Western Front. On the side of the Allied powers, you have the Belgians, the British, the French, and eventually the Americans. So on the Western Front, it is Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, and eventually the United States facing off against the Germans. Okay, so now we move to the Southern Front. The Southern Front. On the Southern Front, at the beginning of the war, it was really just Austria-Hungary doing the fighting for the Central Powers. As the war progressed, however, it became increasingly clear that Austria-Hungary was not strong enough. Despite the size of the empire, Austria-Hungary in the end was not strong enough to carry the fighting on the Southern Front all by themselves. So eventually the Germans will join them. And at first, the Germans are just providing war material, supplies, to support the Austro-Hungarian army. Austria-Hungary was not a very industrialized country. Germany was. So at the beginning, Germany was providing that kind of support. But in time, as Austria-Hungary's army continued to falter, Germany actually sent German troops to the Southern Front to assist them. And that actually helped turn the tide of the war on the Southern Front in favor of the Central Powers. So on the Southern Front, which is essentially Austria-Hungary's border with Italy and Serbia, on the Southern Front, it's Germany and Austria-Hungary fighting for the side of the Central Powers. On the side of the Allied powers, of course, you have Serbia, who were the first country to be attacked anyway, and then Italy as well. Once Italy joined the war on the side of the Allied powers, they would be fighting Austria-Hungary and later Germany also on the Southern Front. So on the Southern Front, it is Serbia and Italy fighting on the side of the Allied powers against Germany and Austria-Hungary fighting for the Central Powers. Finally, we have the Middle Eastern Front. And the Middle Eastern Front sort of spills off the side of this map. The Middle Eastern Front is all sort of over here, down the southeastern side of this map. On the side of the Central Powers, of course, is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was fighting on the side of the Central Powers on the Middle Eastern Front. And then it may be much less obvious to you what country was fighting on the side of the Allied powers on the Middle Eastern Front. The map perhaps doesn't help you that much, but maybe this will give you a hint. There was only one country that had the kind of naval power that would allow them to move their soldiers that far away and have them fighting effectively against the Ottoman Empire. Which of the Allied powers had that kind of naval power? That would have to be the United Kingdom, wouldn't it? Britain. So the British Navy, or the Royal Navy, was strong enough and global enough that it allowed the British to take the fight to the Ottoman Empire down here on the Middle Eastern Front. So now you're set. You have a basic understanding of who's fighting where during this war. I hope that you feel like you understand fairly well where the war came from, why the war broke out, how it got expanded to become a continent-wide war, and I hope you have a clear picture in your mind of which countries are fighting in what fronts of the continent of Europe and for which sides. Now, when we meet again, when we have another lesson, we'll actually get into telling the story of the fighting of the war, the actual battles, starting surprisingly with a major battle on the Eastern Front and shifting quickly to a major battle on the Western Front. So, until then, take good care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay safe. I'll look forward to teaching you again soon. So long, everyone.